Welcome to the Agile Career Podcast, where we will take you on the journey from employed for life to employable for life. We'll give you the tips, insights, and strategies to help you build the transferable skills that you'll need. So let's get started. Please welcome your host, Günther Richter.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the next episode of the Agile Career Podcast. As usual, I've got another great guest on today's show. And as you'll remember, most of our episodes tend to focus on climbing the corporate ladder, not necessarily the corporate ladder, but the career ladder. And in fact, for many people, climbing that ladder seems to be the only option. But we started asking ourselves, what if it wasn't so? What are the alternatives? Are there other things you can do with your career instead of climbing the corporate ladder? So please take a listen to this episode and find out a little bit more what you could be doing with your career. And to help me cover this interesting topic, I've got another great guest on the show, as I've said. Joining me today is Jim Barnish, and Jim spent the last 2 decades growing tech companies as an entrepreneur himself, an operator of a company or a firm, and a consultant as well. Jim now runs Orchid Black, which is a very interesting name, and I'm sure Jim's going to share a little bit more about that. Orchid Black is a growth services firm, complete with growth experts, just like Jim, that really share he's got an enviable track record of making technology companies worth so much more. So without further ado, Jim, welcome to the show.
Hey, Günther, super excited to be here. It's been a long time coming, my friend.
I know, even, aligning calendars and the time zone difference isn't too bad, but things have been a little bit crazy. So I'm glad we're finally getting to chat. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience and share a little bit more about what it is you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So simply put, I am obsessed with helping tech companies and founders grow their businesses and realize massive increases in the value of their business when it comes time to exit. I and the rest of my team at Orchid Black really help founders reimagine what's possible with their companies, their baby, their legacy, right? Because it's all kind of wrapped in the same thing. And I've had a passion for entrepreneurialism and overall growth ever since I joined my own family business over 2 decades ago, with a core focus on acquiring and integrating businesses with one another. That passion really turned to a growth obsession for tech companies not long after, acting as an operator and a consultant for a number of tech-forward companies, largely software as a service or SaaS companies. And that growth really became exponential as I turned towards working with early growth stage SaaS businesses, working with a venture capital firm or a VC firm in my backyard here in Tampa, Florida, which is actually now the most active venture capital firm in the state, Florida Funders. And it was there that I was responsible for finding the best tech companies where I could see a 100x potential, if you will. Companies where investors' capital could see the highest possible passive return on a few, even if many of those companies failed along the way, which is, the well-known venture capital model. Let's call these companies unicorns, for lack of a better word, because that's what many people in the industry call billion-dollar tech companies, is unicorns. It's kind of what they are. But along the way, I saw so many tech companies with incredible potential to generate really awesome returns, even if they weren't unicorns, provided they had the right expert pruning and care, and companies that may take a little bit of active rather than passive work and investment, and had the chance to become just incredibly amazing companies with consistent growth and maybe a 3 or a 5 or a 10x return, even if they didn't have the chance for a 100x or $1 billion unicorn status. And I kind of always thought of these companies as orchids, right? Since orchids can grow to the highest of heights when tended to properly by not just growing fast, but growing smart and then fast. But that's not really what the VC model is about. The VC model is about throwing capital at things and growing them as fast as possible and trying to reach that 100x potential. I thought back to my days as an operator of these orchid companies, if you will, and how hard it was to reach success. Lots of unnecessary failure along the way. And, provided I had the right experts to tend to me with the right pruning and care to take my company at that time to the next level, I would have loved to have something like that, especially if they were willing to take their fees in more of a performance aligning incentives with performance. But nothing like that existed in the marketplace. And so what does one do when they see a gap and a opportunity? Create a company. So that's kind of how the genesis of this growth services practice, Orchid Black, alongside my two fellow managing partners, Stephen Horowitz and Howard Joyce, came to be, where we hunt for those companies that are in the black, which is the other part of the name, Orchid Black, and where we can significantly help founders increase the value of their business and flourish. And yeah, I as you can see, I'm a little bit passionate about what we do and the way that we serve founders. But that's kind of the long and the short of it, if you will.
And that sounds really exciting. And I think as you've talked through it, there's kind of two things or two thoughts that are emerging to me. And one is, in your personal circumstance, the career that you've grown for yourself, as you say, starting off in your family business and working ultimately a bit later in a management consultancy, running companies yourself, and that's a great story as well that's emerging, and the sorts of stories that the listeners like to listen to. And then the other thing is talking about entrepreneurship, I think, and the companies that you work with and nurture. Many people that I interview on the podcast that do have their own companies, many of them have ended up there by accident. It's they've been laid off or something else has happened, and they've just said, let me give this a try myself. Let me start my own thing. And I think in the infancy of those startups, startup, if you will, it's kind of, they're just creating a job for themselves. So it's instead of having an employer pay your salary, you're kind of generating that salary yourself. And they may or may not grow beyond just themselves. And I think for many, they're happy doing that. It's the income that they're after. But I think then there's that middle ground between, I guess, being employed in a corporate or just being a freelancer or being a solo operator. What's this vision I have for my startup? Am I thinking about an exit plan? Do I want to be doing this until I'm 55 or 60 or 65 or whatever? And I think those are the sorts of things that many people don't think about. They're very much focused, stuck in the now, revenue generating, perhaps bringing on one or two people. So I think this is where the story is so interesting, to know that there are partners out there that are perhaps slightly different from the traditional kind of VC or perhaps PE type model, to help ambitious owners of companies grow their companies and be so much more.
Well said. And we've now grown the team to about 30 of these growth experts, right? That all share this incredible background for maximizing growth and technology company value. And, we're all super confident in the work that we do, which is why we take upside rather than cash, right? Cash is the traditional consulting model. And we believe that if you actually believe in what you can do for companies and the way that you can perform, why wouldn't you base your fees on company value, right? On performance, just like the founders are. They're betting on themselves. So if you are a growth expert, bet on yourself too. And that's what we do. We only get paid well when the founder gets paid really well. And that's what I kind of love the most about our model.
It's a good model. It's a risk model, but as you say,
yes,
it's being confident in the abilities of you and your team. And I think spotting those opportunities of those tech companies that you think are those orchids.
Yes, indeed.
I'd recently read a book called The Squiggly Career. And as I alluded to at the opening of the episode, was, the one analogy, I suppose, is climbing that ladder. I think, looking back on your career, it seems kind of more the squiggly one, because you talked about starting off in a family business and then going through a number of steps or a number of career roles before you started up your own firm. I mean, do you want to just talk me through that a little bit? Starting off with you being involved in the family business.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, I love that title of the book. It defines, my journey and a lot of folks that I know. And if I were to sum up my intro, you probably would have heard family, biz, entrepreneur, operator, executive, consultant, venture capital, growth services, right? Like lots of different, squiggles, if you will, right? Certainly not a straight direct line towards corporate growth, if you will. And that's a lot of roles and not a lot of them. In fact, very few of them came about organically. So it was a very squiggly career indeed. There's one time squiggly career decision, if you will. Man, I just can't. That's such a great title that stands out the most. At the time, I was working in a corporate strategy role at a technology solutions provider in the mid-market space, working on the creation of new solutions and evaluating potential acquisitions and all sorts of really fun stuff, if you will. The company happened to have like an awesome culture, probably the best culture I'd ever been a part of, actually. And I was presented with a number of options. I could continue down the current path with a career that I love and a team I adored. I could take an expanded role at my dream company since I was really 15 and one of the best consulting companies on the planet. Or I could take on a few, early stage growth consulting gigs with a lot of risk for early growth companies that would allow me the flexibility to figure out my next big career step. Right. And I actually ended up choosing number 2, right? My dream company. Of course, why wouldn't somebody do that? Right. Why would they not want to take the dream job that they had set out to do? And it wasn't but 6 weeks later or so that I regretted it. Well, I think I immediately regretted it. I only lasted about 6 weeks for a myriad of reasons I can probably get into another time. But it's funny how the things that we desire and dream about when we're 15 or 20 or 30 soon become this distant thought. For me, the core reasons, the culture wasn't right for me. The role didn't turn out to be right for me. And ultimately, like the agility and entrepreneurial nature that I had was just better suited for big consulting company. It was for the getting hands-on, getting your hands dirty, working with businesses that had a lot to risk and risking it with them. And so I elected to transition to that third option to take on a few growth consulting gigs, which is ultimately what took me down both the venture capital and then the Orchid Black growth services path. And so it's funny, this very squiggly line, emerges very clearly, right? And it might even look like a straight line in some cases, but it was as squiggly as one could get. And there was a lot of unrest going through my mind of these are big decisions. And I know a lot of people go through that kind of that journey in their own squiggly line, and some choose one path, others choose another. And, I couldn't be happier where my squiggly line took me.
Well, that's great to hear. And I think it's really interesting how you talk about, having this dream of joining this. I think was it one of the big consulting firms that you joined? And,
yep.
Having, I guess, worked with many people that have worked at some of the larger consulting firms, tend to have mixed, I suppose, experiences and those sorts of things. And it still is very, very aspirational, I think, to work at one of those firms. It looks great on your CV, but I guess, the reality is for some people, it's not going to be a fit for them. As you say, the culture wasn't exactly right for you, and perhaps the role wasn't right either. Yeah. In terms of moving your career forward then and progressing, one of the things you'd said to me when we spoke before, ahead of the interview, was Ikigai. And it's one of my favorite tools I use a lot with my coaching clients to kind of help them find a little direction. And I guess for the listeners who aren't familiar with it, it's a Japanese concept that, refers to something that gives you a sense of purpose or a reason for living. Of course, it brings in together, how do you make that living? How do you get by and all of those sorts of things. Do you want to talk me a little through how you used that approach to try and find your sweet spot and, which was where you were going to settle?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things that just, pop into my head as we start talking about some of these things, right? Consulting and big 3, big 4, right? The traditional consulting framework is really special, right? And it does take the right people. And I love comparing what we do to that, because consulting firms, there is a purpose for a lot of the work that they do, right? And they do great work. But what their typical model is they charge you a retainer to interview you and tell you a lot of validating things and use a standard playbook. And, my life is not about standard, right? Not about, telling you what you want to know or validating what you need to know, right? It's about getting to the root of the orchid, of the strategy, right? Getting to the root of and the dirt beneath the work that we do. And that's that's what's so interesting. Number one, about the work that we do, but number two, about the tool that you bring up in Ikigai. And you have no idea how much I love that you have such a deep appreciation for it, because very few people that I meet know about it. It's something that, I actually showed to my executive coach a few months ago, and he loved it. And so, for the longest time, I was always looking for a simple way to understand my best career path, whether it was, big consulting versus working with founders, or, you name it. And I did lots of career tests and personality tests, and nothing really clicked for me. I was like, shit, will I ever figure this out? But ultimately, I was looking for a way to connect what I want to do, what I love to do, what I can get paid to do, and where I can have an impact on the world. And many people I know go through a similar challenge. In fact, I think everyone goes through that challenge at some point. I'm sure there's somebody or many people in the audience right now that are going through that. And about a decade ago, I did a lot of research, asked around a lot of people, and ultimately landed on this fairly simple diagram, Ikigai, that simplifies that complexity around what most people are never able to get answered in their lifetime. How do I connect what I want to do, what I'm great at, what I can get paid to do, and the impact that I can have on the world? And the simple aha for me that took all the complexity out of it was Ikigai, right? It's like ultimately exactly what I was looking for. I would strongly encourage everyone to go through that exercise. In fact, as part of our performance reviews every year, we'll use Ikigai as a framework to make sure that people are in the right spots, doing the things that they love to do, and otherwise setting them up for success that better meets their own Ikigai. And yeah, it's so clearly a tool that I adore.
Yeah, it's good to hear about that in action. Sometimes these frameworks and I guess other sorts of, be they personality tests or skills tests, can seem a little abstract and theoretical. So what I'll do is I'll put a link in the show notes so the listeners can go and find out more about the tool, as well as one of the books that I found incredibly valuable, talking about Ikigai. There's a few. So I'll pop those up in the show notes so people can go and have a look at them after they listen to the episode. One of the things and one of the components in Ikigai is finding out what you're good at, or stating what you're good at. And one of the things I talk about in every single show is transferable skills. And sometimes I think these seem to be, or they're explained as supplementary skills. And the more I tend to think of it, the more and more I think of it, they tend to be core skills actually for me, because I think these are the skills you need to develop outside of the functional skills of your job. And these are the skills that are going to help you transition, either growing in the company, getting a more senior role, moving into a different role in the same company, moving companies, or even changing careers. If you can build a really strong set of transferable skills, they're going to serve you well as you move through those different scenarios. So I guess my question is, what are the sort of skills that you developed, firstly working in the family business and then in the consulting world, that really served you well when you started moving into running your own companies or running companies and then starting your own? I mean, what were the sort of key transferable skills that spring to mind?
Yeah, it may not sound like skills, but it is. And it comes down to two things. Number one, hard work. Number two, perseverance. And, I feel like from that angle, you've got to first understand one of my favorite quotes, which is that success is not built on success. It's built on failure. It's built on frustration. I believe it was Sumner Redstone. And so my success is built on hard work and perseverance. The hard work of trying to do a lot of things differently to build, grow, and scale tech companies. The hard work of analyzing the data and results of those experiments to understand what worked and what didn't, in order to form more repeatable methodology and things that, can be leveraged in other companies. And that hard work, I mean, what did it get me? Quite a few successes, but damn, a lot of failures. Failures piled up. Projects didn't go exactly as planned. Companies didn't quite hit the goals we set. Most importantly, I learned from them and evolved my thinking for the next go around and the go around after that. And whether I was employed by someone else, consulting on my own, or, founding a company, I spent the last decade of my life figuring out the most efficient way to build and scale growth stage technology businesses, right? That's my niche. and leveraging all this hard work along with market data, of course, and data in general to pinpoint the most effective way to identify the companies that our team at Orchid Black can help the most, and then apply our growth program to significantly increase the value of those businesses in a relatively short time frame. Everyone's got to find their niche, right? And for me to get there took a lot of hard work and a lot of perseverance, and those are my transferable skills.
And were those skills immediately obvious to you?
Honestly, everyone always told me I was a hard worker and lots of perseverance, but it was always the expectation of me growing up. And, that goes back to just the way I was raised and also the expectations I set on myself. I got thrown into the fire at a relatively young age, had no choice but to persevere or burn. And, burning simply isn't an option. And so it's actually taken me a lot of really hard work on myself recently with my executive coach to help me realize that hard work and perseverance are indeed skills and strengths of mine, and that I should appreciate them in myself and especially in others, rather than expecting that everyone I meet have them, which is what I did for, almost my entire life up until about a year and a half ago. Just expected that that's just what everyone should have. Those aren't skills, those are requirements. And, they are skills. And so I have a new appreciation for them, both in myself and for others.
Yeah, I think that's quite poignant, because sometimes we often, judge others by our kind of standards or our experience and think, I would have done this, or I would have done it this way, or, by that stage I had done A, B, and C, and, those sorts of things may not be obvious to others. So I think understanding that's great. And I also like the way you describe the, as skills and requirements, because I think it's solid. It's a set of solid skills or requirements you can build your career and further your career on. I want to unpack that quote you mentioned a bit. Success is not built on success, it's built on failure. And I think that the interesting thing there is the word failure, which kind of alludes to you learning from your mistakes, which again is a really valuable skill to have. Make mistakes, but don't make the same mistake twice. How does that play out in the world that you operate in?
Yeah, a number of ways. Right now, in my business, we can't afford the same level of failure, right? We've got to find the right people that have gone through the failure themselves, because we're teaching founders how to only breed success. There's really two ways to learn. I found one is through all of that failure, and the other is by having the experts at your side to help you navigate what would be failure because they've had the failure, right? And so in our business, because of how niche and focused it is, and how many of the founders we're working with are just stuck in terms of what do I do next in terms of growing my business, whether it's at 5 million or 10 million or 20 million that they've gotten to in revenue. We've got to take our failure and our lessons learned and apply them to the companies that we're working with so that they can understand directionally what they need to do based on our lessons learned, on our failures, and on our successes, of course. And that's really, so we've got to be very careful and selective in the folks that we bring on board. And part of that is really understanding the failure that they've had in their lives in the past, in their successes, right? Because as I mentioned, it's just that we work in such tight time frames with the founders that we're working with that it's incredibly important that we avoid failure at all costs, and that requires that we've had the failure in the past. and where's my failure? I can't even begin to detail that out for you. I've had acquisitions that have gone to zero that I was super excited about in the family business, where I wanted to innovate and do new exciting things, but the company's culture wasn't ready for it. We purchased companies and I did everything I could to make it work, but ultimately the companies ended up going to zero. That's failure, right? The founders that we acquired their businesses ended up doing okay, but it certainly wasn't good for our family business. Failed projects along the years, right? As we were kind of getting our repeatable methodology in place and figuring out what our niche was at Orchid Black to make sure that we get 100% success rate or damn near. And these things, I mean, I could go on and on and on about failure, but those are two perfect examples of how failures pile up and how you kind of need to learn from them. And that's the core of what we try to bring to founders today.
Yeah, no, I think that's well summarized. You talked about your methodology or your framework that you've developed at Orchid Black. You've alluded to some of it as we've been talking about, how do you find that tech company, obviously the methodology you use to find it, how do you find what drives the business, what are the levers you need to pull to kind of grow. When we talked previously about the methodology, you talked about transferable value. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Contrary to popular belief, exit value, if you will, is not about chasing multiples of revenue or EBITDA. It's about creating transferable value by building the business in a manner that attracts and compels the right and the best buyer or buyers and is stress tested against due diligence and buyer or investment criteria. And that puts you in a place where investors and acquirers are calling you. That way you get purchased rather than having to sell. Can I see where I'm going? Right. And hence why many founders are surprised at when it comes time to exit, they're told they're worth much less than they thought they were. Right. And that's for a myriad of reasons that all trace back to this concept of transferable value. We were called into a software company by a founder at Bootstrap for more than a decade and built an amazing business, but was flatlining. Right. And he wanted to exit in the next year and spend his time doing other great stuff. But because he had very low net new logo growth and, a lot of things that wasn't really keeping, his transferable value in mind, if you will, his valuation wasn't anywhere near what he wanted. And he didn't really know where that value was going to be put, even though he wanted to exit. And so when he went to market, to see what he was worth, he was very surprised. Right. And ultimately, he tried his usual ideas to grow and to create what he thought was value within the business, but it wasn't really working like it used to. And his next 12-month forecast, if you will, was only getting worse. So he called us in to help. And, we ran our growth program, our value creation program on his company in a few weeks. And, at the end of it, the founder had a roadmap on how to actually increase the valuation of his business over 50% in the next 12 months. And he was so pleased with the roadmap that, he asked us to stay on with him and run the business, which is what we're very well used to. And so since we were so confident in our plan and the founder, we sacrificed cash and took equity in the company instead. Why would we not? And, that's a great win for us. We ended up actually increasing the value of the business from 23 million to 36 million in 7 months. And that was through a number of different, revenue generating, product focused, transferable value aspects, if you will. And, that's kind of what we're used to. That's the normal value that we provide to companies. And we've got a myriad of examples that I can point to.
Well, I think that's a great example. And as you were talking through that, I'm almost drawing a parallel to, transferable value to transferable skills. So The question I'm asking is, how can you as an individual increase your value? What are those skills that you can learn? Imagine you could increase your salary by 50% in 7 months. That would be phenomenal, So I think, those two they kind of really talk about that. They kind of run in parallel, I guess. And it's thinking, as you highlighted, what are those drivers? What's that plan you can put in place to help grow revenue? Equally so, from an individual point of view, what are those transferable skills or drivers that you can put in place to make you more valuable? You said for this, this example, it's much better to get purchased than to go out and sell yourself. In the same way, getting poached or headhunted, all of those sorts of things are much better than you going on the daily slog, sending out your resume, applying to hundreds of jobs and not ever hearing back from them. So I think there's a great parallel in that story there.
There's an incredible parallel. And there's an incredibly complex number of elements that connect to transferable value. But when it's simplified, it's, strategy, which is kind of the roots of the company, right? Operations, which is kind of the stem of the company, that's its backbone. Product, which are kind of like the leaves of the company, which you grow, one product after another or service, and revenue, which are, the flowers that bloom off of those leaves, right? And then finally, the most important one is talent, which is kind of the water that helps that plant to grow and continue to grow and grow and grow and grow. And that talent aspect is exactly what connects back to that transferable skills concept, because it is the most important part of the company, coupled with strategy, right? The roots in the water are what sustain and drive growth. And so making sure you have the transferable skills to be the most powerful aspect within that water stream is going to be, the way that you're able to increase your value as an individual. So I love that. I actually love that comparison. I'm going to steal it if you don't mind.
Well, I love the way you've laid out, the analogy to the plant or the orchid. So that's absolutely going on the show notes as well. Awesome. In terms of the water and the roots and the backbone and the leaves. I think that was great. The last one you ended on there was talent. Now, I guess thinking about it in the context of your world, there's two things. And one is talent, the talent of your team. At the beginning, you described your team is very talented. And then the other one is the talent of the operators in terms of the companies that you are investing in. What are those sort of skills, I guess primarily transferable skills, that you look for both in your team and the companies that you work with, or the founders of the companies you work with?
Yeah. So start with our team. Everything we do, everything our team does is grounded in data. So primary for us is all things connected to research and data, market research, analytical reasoning, critical thinking, and attention to detail, right? Those are the four that probably come to mind the most. We're also looking for project management skills as a large part of our role. The role our associate team plays is a chief of staff-like role, partnering with our clients and helping to drive growth. For our senior team members, or what we call operating partners, we're looking for a lot more, right? Including leadership and management and relationship building. And really we're expecting them to come to the table as the full package, because they are, right? They are the people that our founders are leaning on, right? They're the folks that are driving the companies with the founders. And so, we're expecting the operating partners to come to the full the table with the full package, and also bet on themselves and their performance the same way we do with the clients that we serve, right? A desire to align compensation with performance as much as possible. But for our rising star associate and analysts, we're taking their problem solving and critical thinking skills to the next level. We're teaching them how to manage and lead. We're taking their verbal and written communication skills to a place that few are able to reach, provided they stick with us long enough, with which the right ones do. And finally, with the founders that we work with, we're looking for the ingredients that we know that we can couple our ingredients with to breed success, right? And that might sound very ambiguous, but we've got a team that's structured around providing gaps to the right companies. So we look for the right companies and the right founders where we know whatever gaps they have that are driving, the lack of transferable value, if you will, we can provide. And so, sometimes that's brilliant tech founders or subject matter experts that have built a company to, 5 or 10 or 20 million based off of their network and what they know. And what they really need is, true operational talent and true commercialization talent and a strategy to take the company to the next level. Sometimes it's the sales founder who literally used their entire Rolodex to get the company to 5 or 10 or 20 million. And what they're really in need of is how to make sure that their technical debt and their product management and all things other than sales are fundamentally in the right place, right? And sometimes it's a little bit of everything, which is why we have the team that we have, and why our program is so special, right? It's very unique, which is why we have to be so niche and only select the companies that we know we can serve the best. So sorry if that was a little bit long of an answer, but
no, that was a great.
Talent is everything to us.
That was a great answer. And you mentioned so many great skills there. The ones that jumped out to me were critical thinking, attention to detail, verbal and written communications, because those are just things you need everywhere. And, you can go from strength to strength if you can get those things right. The other interesting one, you mentioned project management, and many people will say, well, that's kind of more like a functional skill. That's a job, that's a role. It's so important, though, that even if you're not a project manager, that you can manage projects or understand how those work, whether you're managing a third party or you're doing some renovations on your home, because more often than not, you end up managing that yourself rather than the person you've employed to kind of build out that extension. But yeah, so that project management has come up on a number of episodes before as well. So I'm really glad that you drew that one out as well.
Yeah, it's important, especially as you look at the way the world's moving, right? Because, there's always been this concept of generalist and specialist, right? And I feel like the world is moving towards versatilists, which is everyone's kind of got to be a generalist of some sort to understand how things connect, which is where that project management discipline comes in. Or most people anyway. And you've also got to be able to go deep, which is crazy. Like that, you kind of have to be able to do a lot of different things in today's world. It's just with the way things are going and with the way jobs are moving and being upgraded in so many fashions, especially in the world that we live in, that whole concept around versatilist, which I believe it was Gartner that coined, is just something that we preach day in and day out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way of looking at it. We often use the sort of T-shaped description and having that good breadth and understanding where you need to go deep. So I think that's a really great way to describe it. You talked about trends and you talked about the future. I mean, going forward, what are there additional transferable skills that you're focusing on growing in the team? Is there anything top of mind for you that you think is going to be really pertinent in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, we're problem solving in general and critical thinking are, core to us, right? And as I mentioned, we expect our operating partners to have all that. We expect our associates and, analysts or rising stars, if you will, to come to the table with some of that, but for us to grow them into the next operating partners. But really, in today's environment of attracting and retaining talent, I've never seen a environment like we see today, with the idea of, the toughest and most challenging issues that business owners are facing, or just people are facing in general, of hiring and retaining people. When you connect that to the millennial population and, engagement that's expected and how they're changing jobs every couple of years and turnover and, things like that, it's just, there's an environment that is very challenging. And what we've had to do, and what I know a lot of businesses have been going through, is building a business of qualified and talented people that are going to treat your clients or your customers like you would treat them is hard. It's never easy. And in the early stages of a company, whether you're 1 or 5 or 10 people, right? There is a confluence of factors working against you because you got a million things to do, and hiring seems like the last thing that you should be focused on because you got to do so much else, and it's so time consuming to do the right way. And it is something that I've had a lot of hard lessons learned in, rushing through hiring, right? And missing out on some of those transferable skills, if you will, that I, have had some very costly mistakes in doing by rushing through that hiring process. And so, whether you're the one that's looking for the job or you're the one that's hiring, it's equally as important to make sure that you have the right skills, that the person has the right skills for that job. And that's something that I think in today's environment, you mentioned the idea of, going out to the market versus the market coming to you is so important to get right. And I can't stress enough both sides of the hiring process need to be very thoughtful and not rushed. And that's kind of that deep connection to transferable skills, if you will.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, talent acquisition, I mean, for us as well as a business, it's a challenge at the moment. It's definitely a seller's market. It's almost not traditionally, but often, your lack of, or your poor sales pipeline is the limiting factor to your business. But, in some instances, it's now beginning to be that talent, what does that talent pipeline look like? And can you get the right people on board? I mean, obviously, for a product-based company, it might not be that not less important, but definitely for a services company, it can be a real limiting factor. So I'm glad you brought that up. I'd also like to draw back to you thinking about going back at the start of your career and thinking about wanting to work at that consulting firm, very aspirational and saying you wanted to be there. And I think you've touched on that again, saying to candidates, well, think carefully about that role you want. It's always a risk for an employer to take on someone new, but equally so for an employee, it's a risk for you to join a company that you might not be happy with, or that you're not going to enjoy the culture. Whatever it is, the leadership's not great. So absolutely, spend the time, do the research and understand not just the functional aspects of the job, not just the logo, learn a little bit more about what that company looks like on the inside. Yeah, absolutely. And, no matter what the job is, right? Whether it's, starting your own business, right? Learn about what that means to be an entrepreneur first, and make sure that you've got the right transferable skills to do that. I mean, 90 to 96%, depending on where you slice it, of businesses, of startups fail, right? So that's a pretty large number. And a lot of it has to do with the business itself, but more often than not, it's actually the founders, whether it's, realizing that it wasn't right for them, realizing that, they were in the wrong business, whatever, realizing they, weren't necessarily solving a problem that needed the solution they're providing, and a number of different things that, need to be sorted out first. And so whether you're in a pandemic or you're, in a high growth economy, something that you really need to take a look at the external market and also internally at yourself, your ikigai, if you will, and make sure that aligns, because it's, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're joining a company, it's the same thing, just a little bit more risk on one side than the other. Absolutely. I mean, I think those are sage words, if you're thinking about starting your own company or being an entrepreneur. I mean, what else would you say? I mean, what other advice would you give to people that are thinking about entrepreneurship or starting their own gig as a career?
I would say, are you sure? No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, listen, I mean, starting a business is hard and growing a business is even harder, but it is so worth it for those of us that are just entirely nuts. For those of us that, want to put in the hard work is probably, better way to put it than entirely nuts. I don't want to scare people from starting a company. That's not at all. But what I would ask is that all young leaders, or just general leaders, make sure that both entrepreneurialism and grinding as a whole and the problem that they're looking to solve for as an entrepreneur align with their ikigai, which we talked about obviously earlier in the show, probably a couple times. And in short, make sure it aligns with what you do, what you're great at, and the change and impact that you can have on the world. And of course, that you can make money doing it, since we all have to survive. For me, entrepreneurialism as a whole, along with the problem I'm solving for, helping founders make their businesses worth so much more, were my ikigai, right? And so starting Orchid Black was a no-brainer for me, but it's got to align with that, right? You got to be able to see yourself doing it forever, or see line of sight towards what that actually means for you going forward. Don't just start a business to exit the business, right? You gotta be in love and have a passion for what you're doing. And then the exits will come as we connect to that concept of transferable value. So transferable skills and transferable value, right? Connecting once again.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's good advice. Thank you. You talked about leadership, and not all entrepreneurs are natural leaders. And obviously there's a debate, I suppose, born or learned. Personally, I think it's something that can be learned, but absolutely learning it and developing leadership skills is important. So do you have any thoughts on how people can best develop their leadership skills?
Bet I do, especially considering I've been working with a coach for the last year and a half on my own leadership skills. But I'll keep it to 3 basic principles for the purposes of this discussion. But I love this topic, and I could probably talk to you for hours about it. Number 1, leadership is a process, not a position. Don't take that lightly. Number 2, hire the right talent and take care of them. They will take care of your customers. Your customers will take care of you and the organization. It's that simple. All 3, org alignment, customers, employees make the business run, and you've got to have an aligned strategy to ensure success. And so, that's number 2 is hire the right talent and take care of them. Number 3, there was a time when people used the term leadership and management interchangeably, but they were wrong. And they have always been wrong. And there is a massive difference between the two. Leadership deals with people and their dynamics, which are continually changing. The challenge of leadership is to create change and facilitate growth. And those conditions require movement, which is inherent to moving up from one level of leadership to the next, right? Good leadership isn't about advancing you like a career path. It's about advancing your team. And you've got to be ready for that shift, because you don't want to be the person doing everything, right? You don't want to be the person that's good at everything. You want people on your team that are better than you, and you want people to be aligned with your mission. And that's leadership. That's not management. And I guess I know I said 3 things, but a connecting point to all of this is probably a 4th point, which is if you're looking to read up on it and you haven't yet read How Successful People Lead, or $1 Trillion Coach, or How to Win Friends and Influence People, I would say those 3 books are pivotal in terms of shifting shifting that shift and focus, I guess. And I encourage you to do so, like now, to upgrade your leadership skills, especially the How Successful People Lead, which really dives into the 5 different levels of leadership that I believe just totally nail it as you work from level 1, which is position, to level 5, which is pinnacle, right? Kind of the movement from, people lead because they have a right to, right, to people follow you because they've got a respect for what you represent. And there's levels in between, obviously, but I won't spoil the book.
Yeah, no, those are brilliant points. I mean, I love all of those. I think, they do truly resonate. I think, in Simon Sinek, for instance, has got a lot of what he says, totally mirrors what we've been talking about. So those are all great points. Made notes about those books. So I'll pop those up in the show notes as well, so the listeners can go and have a look at those books. It's amazing how often Dale Carnegie comes up, even today. So many people speak about it. So yeah, that's great to hear. I guess one last question, and we may have preempted this already with your quote you made earlier about success not being built on success, but are there any other favorite life quotes or life lessons that have truly affected, I guess, your life?
Yes. And I'll give a different one only because I'm an avid sports fan and I'm from the Midwest. And so, as we all do in the Midwest in the US, we love Michael Jordan. And one of my favorite things that Michael Jordan said was, talent wins games, but team and intelligence win championships. And connecting back to that concept of leadership, I used to be the do-it-all leader, or do-it-all person, I should say, not even leader. The one who starts working at 5 a.m. and turns the computer off at 1 a.m., gets a couple hours sleep. Grind never stopped. It was exhausting, physically, mentally, spiritually, you name it. I was worn out. I felt like I needed to do everything. And if I didn't, who would, right? Even though I had co-founders and employees, every time I unloaded one responsibility, I would simply take on 2 more. And I did that in my personal life as well, but it's just unsustainable. And beyond that, it wasn't working. We at the time were growing as a company, but not in a scalable way, right? And until I stopped trying to be the driving force behind everything, think Michael Jordan in the 80s, right? Scoring champion with 3 playoff losses. The cycle was doomed to repeat until I started being more like Michael Jordan in the 90s with 6 championships, which was essentially a lesson in not needing to be the scoring champion, focusing on the team and intelligence amongst the team and leadership, and taking the company to a place where it could win some championships. And it was a lesson in letting go and putting the right people in the right places and letting them grow. And, coming back into the spark in the company that I believe has been there for the last year or so. That's what I was waiting to see. One that, takes and leads the company and the talent within the company, driving the company forward, allowing the company to flourish. And I guess the takeaway there with that quote is, be like Mike, right? Championships are always better than scoring titles. And you can still be the leader, but you don't always need to have the ball in your hands.
Yeah, that is, it's amazing you said that, because there's so many stories and analogies and lessons we can take from sport. And just prior to this podcast interview, we were doing some coaching with our youth rugby team ahead of a big match tomorrow. And one of the England players, we used him as an example, Moro Itoje, saying exactly the same thing. He doesn't have the ball in hand often. He doesn't score tries, but look at his work rate. Look how he positions himself. He's either protecting the ball, protecting a teammate, tackling someone, clearing out a ruck, and it's not he's not the one putting the ball down, but he's the one that's making it happen, or one of the 15 that's making it happen. So it's almost like you were tuning into the meeting we had earlier with the boys. So that's really great. And yeah, the quote by Michael Jordan's great. I think, did he also say you miss 100% of the shots you don't take?
I don't know if that was him or another ball player, but yeah, it was definitely somebody. Yeah, that's a great one as well. Or fall 7 times, get up 8, which was Dwayne Wade from the Miami Heat, right? There's, to your point, whether it's football or basketball or baseball or, rugby, whatever it is, right? There are so many analogies in sports that we can take, which is quite frankly why entrepreneurs and business leaders are kind of like athletes, right? You need to, you play hard, but you also need to train and you need to recover. And you need to do all the same types of things. It's just pro athletes are probably better at taking time to recover and train and also celebrate than I think business leaders are, which is, we could probably take some lessons from these pro athletes. Let me tell you.
Yeah, you're right. As you said, finish the grind one day, big win, you might not celebrate that success and you're into grind the next day. So I think that's great. Yeah. I guess as anyone, whether you're an entrepreneur or working in a corporate, look towards those leaders in sport, read about them, play sport yourself as well. It's incredibly good for your well-being and your career as well. So I think some really good wisdom there and some good advice. That's brilliant. When I said I had a last question, it wasn't really the last question. My last question really is, if listeners want to find out more about you or get in contact, how do they best do that?
If you want to connect direct with me, you can find me on LinkedIn or on our website at orchid.black. I have complimentary office hours every week, and I'm happy to take some of that time to chat about all things growth, whether that's, career growth, personal growth, or business growth. And I'll try to leverage my network as best as I can to help you. Only thing I would ask of you in advance of reaching out, provided you enjoyed this episode, is to give our friend Gunter and the Agile Career Podcast a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening on. I would appreciate that. And, really have enjoyed this time with you, Gunter, today.
That's great, John. Thanks so much for that. I think I hope the listeners, get loads of value from this. And thank you so much for your offer as well. I think that's really generous. And I absolutely would encourage people to take that up. So I'll also pop those details on the show notes, the link to your LinkedIn, the link to your website, and hopefully you'll hear from some listeners.
Awesome. Can't wait.
Jim, thank you so much. It's been really awesome. I've loved our chat, and I look forward to listening to this a number of times when I do the production.
Terrific. Me too, when it's in production.
All right, brilliant. Thanks so much.
All right, take care. Thanks again.
You too. Bye.